When I spoke to South Koreans from both camps, that is to say, pro-Yoon and anti-Yoon, what they told me was they came out to protest because they wanted to be able to tell their children and their families that they stood up at the time when their democracy was imperiled. And that's something that I know has resonated with Americans.
This is the Rhyme and Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover. I hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it. I'm your host, Jeremy Goldkorn. I grew up in apartheid South Africa down the road from Elon Musk. I came of age in China. I usually come to you from Nashville, Tennessee on this podcast, but this episode, the 7th, Rhyme and Chaos, was recorded on April 14, 2025, when I was in Birmingham, Alabama, on a road trip with my family. I was in a very echoey loft apartment. We have not been able to fix the sound very well, so please forgive me the audio quality. I've also produced this episode more than most. Before recording the podcast that day, I'd spent the afternoon with my wife and kids visiting a few places in Birmingham where important clashes in the United States civil rights movement happened. We went to the 16th Street Baptist Church, where in 1963 the Ku Klux Klan exploded a bomb, killing 4 little girls. Opposite the church is a park where demonstrations were violently suppressed by Bull Connor, the city's Commissioner of Public Safety. But the civil rights protesters persisted, and the American South eventually desegregated. This reminded me that hope and optimism are really necessary in hard times. You can't successfully combat fascists and authoritarians with despair. And that this Rhyme and Chaos podcast should not only be elegiac, it should also be a source of hope. So for this episode, I was delighted to be joined by Anthony Kuhn, the velvet-voiced national public radio correspondent in Seoul, South Korea. I know Anthony from his many years of reporting from China. He has also headed up NPR's Southeast Asia coverage from Jakarta, Indonesia, and served previously as NPR's correspondent in London. We talked about South Korea, a country that only became a democracy rather recently, but seems to now serve as an example that the United States might be able to learn from. As part of my wish to inspire hope for this podcast, we've also used new music in the introduction. It's a composition by Wu Fei and played by her on the guzheng. It's called Paperboy. The podcast still plays out with Wu Fei playing and singing Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1. And before you relax too much, right at the end of this podcast, Anthony talks about some extraordinary speculation in Korea about recent events that made me think about what a dangerous world we're living in right now. An age of madmen who are willing to gamble with millions of people's lives. Welcome to Rhyme and Chaos, Anthony.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Anthony, I'm going to try and sum up Korean history in a laughably short amount of time and then ask you to bring us up to date to the minute. So the Korean peninsula has been inhabited for, many thousands of years. By the 7th century, the Silla kingdom unified the peninsula, establishing the first cohesive Korean state. The subsequent Goryeo and Joseon dynasties from 918 to 1392 and from 1392 to 1910. These dynasties witnessed cultural flourishing, technological innovations like movable type printing, actually predating the invention attributed to Gutenberg by more than 200 years, and also the creation of the Hangul alphabet, which Koreans still use to write their language. But in the Joseon dynasty, Korea was known as the Hermit Kingdom, referring to a deliberate restriction of contact with the outside world. And the little peninsula is split off from the Asian mainland by mountains and a big river, the Yalu River. They limited trade, travel, and interactions with other nations. And as with Qing dynasty China, this isolationism made the country rather vulnerable, and Japan colonized Korea from 1945. World War II ended Japanese colonial rule, but the peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel into Soviet and American occupation zones, which hardened into separate states, North Korea or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea under Kim Il-sung, and South Korea under Syngman Rhee. The devastating Korean War from 1950 to 1953 killed millions, but ended with boundaries largely unchanged. Like Taiwan, South Korea emerged in the 1980s from military dictatorship to become a vibrant democracy, an economic powerhouse. North Korea, on the other hand, has developed nuclear weapons, has the most amazing, spectacular mass games displays, and TV news that Donald Trump would die for. But it remains a very poor country under Kim Jong-un, the grandson of Kim Il-sung. Is that about right, Anthony? Can you set the context for the news coming out of Korea right now, which maybe we could start with the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye in 2017? For a role in a corruption scandal?
Yes. Well, I'll just say, as far as history is concerned, South Korea is a pivotal geographic and historical place in Asia, the transition from the Asian continent to maritime Asia. And it's a place where many wars have been fought between major powers of Asia, as you pointed out, as recently as the Korean War. In recent years, in every respect, South Korea has really been punching above its weight to economics or culture. It is really on a roll. And this country is only the size of about the state of Indiana and is yet one of the top economies and top cultural powers. And this is why the news of the political crisis and the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-Yeol has come as such a shock, has come as such a sort of a time warp, dragging the country back to the military dictatorship. And the last time martial law was imposed was some 4 decades ago. So it was just shocking to everybody that this could happen. But as you pointed out, the first democratically elected president in South Korea to be removed from office was, in fact, Park Geun-hye, who was impeached in 2016, removed the following year. She is the daughter of Park Jong-hee, the military ruler who oversaw the country's rapid development and authoritarian rule during the 1960s and 70s. In 2016, South Korean media reported that an aide of Park Geun-hye's named Chae Soon-sil had pressured some of the country's top conglomerates, including Samsung and Hyundai and Lotte and others, to make large donations to foundations that this aide controlled. She was also reportedly editing presidential speeches of Park Geun-hye and also reading her presidential briefing materials, although she was not an elected official and held no official position.
This sounds sort of familiar.
Yes. So it was considered, a leaking of a very sensitive classified material and interference by someone who also was connected to a sort of religious sect. She was basically seen as connected to shamanism. So South Korea's national legislature, the National Assembly, impeached her in December of 2016. And after that, the Constitutional Court voted to remove her from office the following March. After that, she was tried and sentenced to consecutive terms in prison, totaling 33 years for corruption and abuse of power, but finally pardoned by the liberal President Moon Jae-in in 2021. And that was the occasion for what was called the Candlelight Revolution, when millions of Koreans took to the street to defend their democracy and express their support of her removal from office.
And so what happened after that? After she was removed from office, what was the next step in presidential politics?
Well, she was followed by a far more liberal President Moon Jae-in. And on the domestic front, he was one of the politicians who cut his teeth under the military dictatorship and spent his early career pushing for democratization. As a liberal, he was in favor of closer engagement with North Korea and China, and he oversaw a brief period of diplomacy and engagement with North Korea in 2018 and 2019. It began with the Winter Olympics in 2018 in Pyongyang. And then, as you remember, there was a period of diplomacy which included 2 summits between then President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. In 2018, it was in Singapore, and in 2019 in Hanoi, Vietnam. And ultimately, President Trump and Kim Jong-un were unable to strike a deal. Diplomacy basically collapsed, and North Korea's position hardened. He came to basically declare South Korea not as a part of the same separated state, but as a hostile enemy. and he accelerated the buildup of his nuclear arsenal. And things between the two countries have been exceedingly tense since then. We don't know. President Trump has talked about resuming negotiations and diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, but Kim felt he had been burned. He had been betrayed by Trump after the Hanoi summit, and he's basically thrown his lot in with Vladimir Putin in Russia. So experts are really not sure whether Kim is up for more rounds of negotiations with Trump. Then, following Jae-in, the 2022 election saw the rise of Yoon Suk-Yeol, who was a political novice and served as a previous prosecutor, but was really a political outsider with not much political experience. And he essentially took a very hard line towards North Korea, saying that Moon's era of diplomacy and engagement had been a fake peace, that he had appeased North Korea and China, and that South Korea was going to essentially achieve peace through strength and deterrence of North Korea. So that's what we've seen up until December 3rd of last year, when people were shocked to see this message flash on their cell phone saying that Yoon had imposed martial law. And, as I was saying, people have felt that South Korea has really been on a roll in politics and economics and culture. Such a thing as martial law, harking back to 4 decades ago, was just unthinkable. People weren't sure if they were dreaming, if there was a mistake, but it turned out to be true. The imposition of martial law only lasted for about 6 hours before being overturned by a vote of parliament, but it started a political crisis which is absolutely convulsed the country up until now. The Constitutional Court only recently ruling to remove Yoon from office and clearing the way for new presidential elections to be held on June 3rd of this year.
Who is currently running the country?
The country is currently under the acting presidential leadership of Han Duck-soo, the prime minister.
And he's from the same party. I mean, how is it working? Is it like, if you have to explain this to an American looking at America right now, what would be the relevant comparison, do you think? If that's a reasonable thing to ask.
Yeah. Well, I think the main comparison to make is that when people look at what Yoon Suk-Yeol did, they tend to note similarities between his declaration of martial law and January 6th, 2021 in the U.S. That is to say, media and political scientists tend to categorize Yoon's declaration of martial law as a self-coup. And by that, what they mean is that Yoon was democratically elected, so he didn't seize power as in a regular coup d'etat, but he tried to enlarge or prolong his power by sweeping away other constitutionally mandated institutions. Now, what Yoon Suk-Yeol claimed was that the opposition-controlled parliament was essentially paralyzing the work of government, that they were impeaching his political appointees, they were stymieing his efforts to govern the country and get legislation through the parliament, and this amounted to a national crisis, and so he had no choice but to declare martial law just as a warning to people. That argument did not stand up in court. Basically, South Korean presidents can declare martial law, but only in case there is a war, a national emergency, a breakdown of public order, none of which was the case. And this is what the National Assembly argued when they voted down his martial law decree, when they voted to impeach him, and also the argument that was upheld by the Constitutional Court. In the case of January 6, 2021, that was an attempt to overturn the election of 2020, U.S. presidential election. In Yoon's case, it was an attempt to sweep away checks and balances on Yoon's power provided by Parliament and mandated by the Constitution. And so, this fits into a tradition of self-coups that go back centuries, including attempts at self-coups by Napoleon Bonaparte, by Adolf Hitler, but it didn't succeed, partially because South Koreans were very quick to take to the streets to defend their democracy, and lawmakers were very quick to run to parliament despite the presence of troops and police and managed to overturn the vote in a matter of hours, managed to overturn Yoon's martial law decree in a matter of hours.
Why do you think that Korea has been able to respond to this constitutional crisis or crisis of democracy so effectively when the same checks and balances that we have heard about for my entire life in the United States seem to have just completely failed?
Well, there are several things to consider here. First is that people are praising South Korea because of what they call its democratic resilience. It's precisely this instinct of South Koreans to take to the streets, to make their voices heard, to protest. When I spoke to South Koreans from both camps, that is to say, pro-Yoon and anti-Yoon, what they told me was they came out to protest because they wanted to be able to tell their children and their families that they stood up at the time when their democracy was imperiled. And that's something that I know has resonated with Americans because I've seen these comments, when I've reported on this. At the same time, we have to say that the fact that Yoon was able to do this was a failure of the system. There should be a way to prevent a president from doing this. And this is why South Korea has been debating what needs to be changed within its system. So we've said that South Korea was under military rule up until the late 1980s. And so for decades, its main goal was to be able to elect its own president. And the system has really been focused on that president. It's a central system as opposed to a federal system in the U.S. So a lot of the powers are controlled by the president. The prime minister in South Korea is appointed by the president instead of in, say, for example, the French system where the parliament appoints the prime minister. So there's a high concentration of power at the top, and there's now a debate in South Korea whether that power should be decentralized, perhaps more along the lines of the French system. The other thing is when you have a self-coup or any sort of coup, there have also been regular coups by the military in South Korea. Coups take muscle to enforce, and that often means military power. So one of the reasons that Yoon's self-coup did not work was that although he sent the military to parliament to drag the lawmakers out of the parliament and prevent them from voting against his martial law decree, the military didn't follow the orders. They had a civic conscience that this was not the right thing to do, and it just didn't work. But because of the role that the military can play in these coups, one of the reforms that people have been talking about is that they need stronger civilian oversight of the military, and they need to be sure that the military commanders in power are going to follow the Constitution. And Yoon, although he's already been impeached and removed from office, he's now on trial for insurrection. And one of the key issues is whether he ordered his military commanders to arrest the lawmakers. He says that's not true, but his commanders have testified that they received direct orders to physically haul the lawmakers out of parliament. And that's why he's being charged with insurrection, the maximum penalty for which is death or life imprisonment.
What is the mood in Korea right now? Like, how are people thinking about these events?
Well, it's clear that this has been, a very, very stressful experience for many South Koreans. People have lost a lot of sleep and have been unable to eat and have been depressed about it. Part of the shock of this was the martial law decree itself, which basically suspended all political rights for South Koreans. They could be arrested for any sort of political speech, any sort of protest. Military censorship of the media would have come into force. And so the shock of this thing was just enough to really upend people's lives. And it's only slightly improving with the removal of Yoon from office. But we have to say that the crisis is not ending here. And part of the underlying problem is the very, very deep political polarization of South Korean society, which is something that's shared in other democracies. And that is to say that there is a loss of trust in the institutions of government, of the media, of the justice system. People feel the system is rigged against them, and they feel that because the system is rigged, as long as it's their people that's doing it, they can end run the constitutional rules. They can get around the key pillars of democracy in order to fix the system. And so while the polls show that a majority of people support Yoon's impeachment and removal from office, there have still been large numbers in favor of Yoon, a lot of which have had protesters carrying signs saying, "Stop the steal." They've called on President Trump to help President Yoon and help South Korea. President Yoon himself has invoked the Supreme Court ruling that basically said that President Trump's official acts are immune from prosecution, and therefore he should have the same thing. And in fact, under South Korean law, he does enjoy immunity from prosecution, except in cases of insurrection, which is what we're facing here. This whole political crisis has left a vacuum. The country is now under the threat of U.S. tariffs, which threaten havoc upon an economy which is very much driven by exports, especially cars and semiconductors to the U.S., and it really lacks effective leadership right now to deal with this huge crisis, not to mention dealing with the tensions with North Korea.
Can you talk a little bit about the manosphere that's known and the rise of Yoon? I mean, from what I read, one of his sort of key pillars of support in South Korea in the electorate seems to have been disaffected young men who are like pissed off with family, which seems to rhyme a little bit with U.S. voters' support for Trump. Does that make any sense?
Yes, of course. So when Yoon was elected to president in 2022, he had to curry favor with young swing voters in their 20s and 30s who made up about a third of eligible voters at that time. And as you said, a lot of young men in South Korea felt like they were unfairly losing out to women in competition for spots at the top schools, in top jobs, just brutal socioeconomic competition. And President Yoon has been accused of exploiting that discontent for the election. Yoon essentially blamed feminism for a lot of South Korea's problems, including its low birth rate. Yoon denied during his presidential campaign that there is a problem of structural gender discrimination in South Korea, and this is despite the fact that there are very large gender gaps in wages and political participation. South Korea lags behind other developed economies in these regards. He later had to backpedal from that assertion, but he also curried favor with these young voters by promising to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality, which not only promotes equality among the sexes, but does things like help victims of sexual violence. As it turns out, he did not keep his promise. He did not abolish that ministry, but there hasn't been any minister in charge of that ministry since 2023. This has to do with some very, very basic problems. Despite South Korea's progress and advancement in many areas compared to other developed economies, its excellence in healthcare and education and all sorts of things, it really lags behind other economies in terms of gender equality and the gender wage gap. And there is a huge political divide now between men and women, particularly in their 20s and 30s, with men trending more conservative and women more liberal. And again, Yoon has been accused of exploiting those gaps for his own political purposes.
Another thing that rhymes, I think, with the United States. So do you think that there's something that Americans can learn from South Korea about protecting democracy?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing is that the two countries have in common is that they are both representative democracies. They're not direct democracies. Both elect people to represent them and do the business of governing. And in South Korea, part of the problem of polarization is that people feel that their elected representatives are not getting the job done. And polarization has created a system in which basically the two main parties, liberal and conservative, spend most of their time in political combat and jousting and not getting the business of government done. And then, when we had this completely unexpected and to many people unimaginable self-coup and imposition of martial law, then it really became clear that the elected representatives were not getting things done, and it was up to citizens to take direct action to go into the streets. But, as we mentioned, this is an example of the resilience of democracy. It's basically the last defense of a democracy is when the people have to take matters into their own hands. But it is a chance for them to institute political reforms which can prevent the system from failing and prevent it from coming to this political crisis in future.
What do you think South Koreans are feeling about America right now?
Well, that's also very highly divided. And I think for America's main allies in East Asia, and I'm particularly talking about Japan and South Korea, they are presented with a choice which is really unthinkable and extremely unpalatable. And that is a choice between their alliance with the U.S., which has long been a cornerstone of their national policies, particularly their diplomatic and defense policies, this alliance with the U.S., and the so-called rules-based international order, which they have come to see themselves as essential parts of, in which the U.S. has continuously praised their role in as both beneficiaries and protectors of this international order. And these two things now seem to be contradictory, and it's very tough for them to know what to do. Another way to look at it is there's a phrase in South Korean, it's also used in Japanese, it's anmi kyongjong, or in Chinese, anmei jingzhong, which means for security, they rely on the U.S., for economic relations, they rely on China. Again, they're forced to make an unpalatable choice. South Koreans in the business sphere mutter, not very publicly, but they're very unhappy about being forced to make this choice. South Korean and Japanese countries are essentially being strong-armed into cutting their business with China and moving their production to the U.S., whether it's not clear at all that they can essentially achieve America's reindustrialization. What happens when there's another change of administrations? The Biden administration tried to give them incentives to move production to the U.S. The Trump administration seems to be using tariffs to achieve the same thing, essentially, in their eyes, coercion and arm twisting. There are not a lot of palatable options. They cannot switch and completely choose China, both as their security guarantor and their main business partner. Another option would be to completely go it alone, which would probably entail acquiring nuclear weapons. There really are no palatable options. At the moment, they appear to be just trying to strike a deal with the U.S., not retaliating against the U.S. tariffs, but trying to avert the worst of the damage from the trade war.
We're so fucked.
That's putting it mildly. It's just a huge crisis. It's on the order of magnitude of, the 1972 Nixon shock, when Nixon basically, with no real warning, reached out to China, thereby throwing Japan's role as the American main ally in the U.S., basically just sparking fears of abandonment. And of course, now the Trump administration's focus on a Taiwan contingency, a conflict between mainland China and Taiwan, both has Japan and South Korea very worried that, U.S. troops from bases in their countries will be diverted to a conflict over Taiwan, and they will get hit as a result. So it's a very tense time for them.
If you had to predict the next 12 months, U.S. relations with South Korea, China, Japan, what might you predict?
So as I mentioned, we're going to see presidential elections to replace President Yoon on June 3rd. The front runner at this point is the opposition leader, Lee Jae-myung, who is of the same generation, essentially in a similar category to people like Jae-in, and for him, this is called the 386 generation, which means they were born in the 60s, went to college in the 1980s, and were in their 30s as South Korea became a democracy. So they're generally in favor of diplomatic engagement with China and North Korea. They tend to be a little bit more skeptical, allying with the U.S. and Japan to deter North Korea and China, solely relying on deterrence. So if Lee Jae-myung comes to power, that could mean big changes for the geopolitical situation in East Asia. Now, a few days ago, China said after a meeting of the trade ministers of China, South Korea, and Japan that they were going to respond together to U.S. tariffs. South Korea later said that's a bit of an exaggeration. They're not going to act together on this. But what they are going to do is going to try to speed up negotiations for a free trade agreement. So it's possible that they will, in some respects, pull closer together. Another possibility is that the diplomatic engagement with North Korea of the 2017 and 2018 period was made possible by the liberal administration of Moon Jae-in. He helped provide an off-ramp for Kim Jong-un to reach out to the U.S. and try to strike a deal in which North Korea gave up a part of its nuclear arsenal in exchange for sanctions, relief, and some security guarantees. Now, that didn't work out. They didn't really have the foundations of that deal built when they went into the summits. But it's possible that once again, South Korea could serve as some sort of broker or bridge between the U.S. and North Korea if both sides are willing to return to the negotiating table. So it could see quite a shift in policies. But let's also remember that the diplomatic window of 2018 and 2019 was preceded by the so-called days of fire and fury when Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump traded insults and threats about who had the most powerful nuclear arsenal. This period of brinksmanship was highly unsettling for residents of South Korea who have long been used to living under the gun and within range of North Korea's weapons. So things between South Korea and North Korea are very tense right now. So how the presidential election works out in June will be essential which way to...
Let me slightly repeat a question, but put directly, what is the most important thing Americans can learn from South Korea about protecting a democracy?
Oh, there's so many things. Just to give you one example, first of all, South Korea just has this very, very vibrant culture of political protest that kicks into full gear whenever there is a political crisis. And this culture has been developed and honed for more than a century. Obviously, it became very strong in fighting Japanese colonial rule from 1910 to 1945. It continued under decades of military dictatorship. It means that South Koreans are very good at mobilizing. Street protests, political street protests in South Korea are an amazing event to be at. The energy, the sound systems, the food carts are all amazing. Yeah, food, seriously. But just the passion, a sense of commitment and responsibility for the nation's fate are really quite something. At the same time, the differences in culture and what you see at these protests is very interesting. When you go to, for example, a conservative protest, the key groups you see are military veterans. I was at a protest outside the Constitutional Court just before Yoon was removed from office. And there were veterans in their 70s and 80s in their military uniforms, some of whom had fought alongside U.S. troops in Vietnam during the 60s and 70s. Also, earlier, I interviewed a woman in her 70s who said, Trump really ought to be helping us. And, the easiest thing to do would just be to make South Korea the first state of the United States. And as an American, of course, it's nice to feel that people are so friendly to the U.S. But at the same time, I think many Americans would want to say, look, the U.S. is having some serious problems of its own. Taking on a 51st state on the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean would be quite an undertaking and perhaps a bridge too far.
And our current rulers are completely incompetent, so maybe you don't want us taking over your country.
Yeah, and also what's amazing, I think, is that despite all these protests, there really was no violence. And before, I had been to protests during the 90s and 2000s in South Korea that got pretty rough. The liberal protesters, which included students and trade unions, often came to protests with steel pipes and whacked it out with riot police, with shields and water cannons and tear gas. That has essentially disappeared, and increasingly, I'm told there is a consensus that both sides need to keep it democratic and nonviolent. So political culture continues to evolve, and I think in generally good ways. As I said, South Koreans have felt very stressed out by their political crisis, but looking at the U.S., things seem a little bit better. Also, I think among some South Koreans, there's been frustration at the sort of unequal, lopsided nature of the alliance, in the fact that when they're under threat from U.S. tariffs, they can't fight back. They really can't impose retaliatory tariffs in the U.S. There's a sort of an expectation that, allies are going to cooperate on an economic level as well. And that has gone back decades. There's always been a sort of implicit bargain on the economic side. I learned, for example, in writing about South Korea's participation in the Vietnam War, that the Hyundai Motor Company, the Hyundai Group, got a contract building barracks for the U.S. military in Vietnam, which not only made them scads of money, but also gave them a lot of experience. So I think that the allies are in a much stronger position. The U.S. really needs them. And so the U.S. not only needs to treat them more equally, it also needs to consider their position their proximity to China, the risk they face compared to the U.S., which is on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And they're trying very hard to make this case, how much they are contributing to the U.S., both strategically and militarily, and also economically, the way they're investing in the U.S. and creating millions of jobs, and that the role they can play in helping the U.S. to industrialize, if that policy will continue through future U.S. administrations.
A big if.
Things could have come out much worse. There could have been bloodshed. The military could be in power. There's one thing I didn't mention. There's one piece of unfinished business which has been of great concern to me, and that is allegations that South Korea, that President Yoon instructed military commanders to conduct a military strike against North Korea to trigger a North Korean backlash, which could then be used as a pretext for martial law. Now, this is still being investigated. It didn't become a part of the impeachment trial or process, but it sort of upends everything we know about North Korea being the one that conducts provocations. Essentially, we're talking about South Korea ordering a kinetic military strike against the North to trigger a counter-provocation to justify martial law. And that, of course, could have put U.S. troops in harm's way. It could have risked military escalation from a nuclear-armed power, an extremely dangerous and extremely unsettling thing. We constantly see that North Korea is the one that's staging provocations. But here we're talking about a South Korean provocation. So it's something that people need to stay tuned for and pay attention to.
The Rhyme and Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn, and edited by Cadra Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Jin No Pedi No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please do take out a paid subscription at rhymeandchaos.com. Thank you, Anthony.
My pleasure.